Last time I said it would be a week, but now that turned into a month. Okay, it's time to be more active, and let's finish the video we started earlier. The Cold War in the 1980s was an interesting moment, and I love how it was depicted in the media. But it was also a moment that marked the beginning of the end of the Cold War.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Many people saw it as a good moment for Europe and an end to the idea of clashing sides, but others saw this as unfair. I don't even have to state who we've been talking about this whole time, and I actually looked up, yeah, this is what the guy looks like. I mean, I thought I was dealing with some of that old Bolshevik conservative kind of guy, but turns out we're working out with a tranny here. So let's take a look at Viki's last interpretations of the Cold War.
In the late 80s, the German people were demonstrating against the Berlin Wall. To oversimplify, they had been talking about letting people travel over the inter-German border without visa for some time. Then this man misread something in a press briefing, and as a result, half of the population of East Berlin wanted to go have a look at the West. They thought they had the right to cross the border now. The guards still had orders not to let them pass. Eventually, they could not hold the people anymore and just let everyone go to West Berlin.
Well, that is a very summed up way of putting it. Now, a lot of what he said is correct, but what I have an issue with is where he states that the main reason for the fall of the Berlin Wall was because they wanted to visit West Berlin. Let's take a look at that. By the 1980s, it was quite apparent that the Cold War would come to an end. The economies of the Eastern Bloc were quite sluggish, and the new Secretary General Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to introduce new policies that would try to kickstart it. They were glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or allowing market incentives to Soviet citizens. This was more like the spark that ignited the fuse, and people in the Eastern Bloc wanted more of it. It finally started in 1989 when elections were held in Poland, which voted for a non-communist government. The world thought that Soviet tanks would invade the country again in order to stop the pro-Soviet government from falling, but Gorbachev refused to act, and just like dominoes, the Eastern Bloc fell apart. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Bulgaria, and Romania, though violently, got rid of their communist governments. Even the Baltic states vied for independence, as they publicly pointed out how they were illegally annexed during World War II, which even brought up a small armed conflict in Lithuania. There's a lot here that Viki didn't mention, but was important to the end of the Cold War.
The Berlin Wall was gone now. Please note that most people in East Germany did not want to live under capitalism or to unite with capitalist West Germans. What they wanted was a new and more democratic East German republic with good relations with and free movement to West Germany. 71% of East Germans opposed the unification of Germany. Unfortunately, the Chancellor of West Germany wanted to get re-elected, so he united the two countries against the will of the people.
That's right, people. Despite the fact that regular people were tearing down the wall with pickaxes and others had been scaling it for decades, meant that they didn't want to be united with the West. It's especially lovely to see that argument when the first free general elections in March 1990, the Party of Democratic Socialism was heavily defeated by the new coalition under Lothar de Maizière, the leader of a coalition known as the Christian Democratic Union. This was a party that openly advocated for reunification, and they were elected. It kind of sounds like that they did want reunification. Now, as a source, he gave a German newsletter which says that only 27% of East Germans wanted to reunify, but that page doesn't give any references. Yeah, he's doing it again.
There is a video to be made on this, since 30 years later the old East German states still suffer immensely from this, and they likely will for the next 50 years. Things like these were happening all over the socialist world, and many countries reformed their way into or were forced into free market capitalism.
That's kind of their own fault, as a lot of leaders that came into power were just corrupt oligarchs who wanted to use the situation for their own gain. They continue to stand in many countries such as Belarus, Romania, Bulgaria, some former Yugoslav countries, Moldova, and of course, the protagonists of the Soviet Union.
Then Gorbachev came into power in the USSR and he implemented perestroika and glasnost, which were policies that had to do with, well, actually the collapse of the Soviet Union is definitely gonna be its own video. So subscribe. Essentially, he did some reform, screwed it up, and collapsed the Soviet Union in the process. And this is where the Cold War ends, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this was my biased telling of the story of the Cold War. Please know, everything I said was correct. It's all true. So why does it sound like I'm an evil Soviet spy sent to indoctrinate everyone into thinking the capitalist nations were aggressors in the Cold War? Because we aren't used to hearing that part of the story. When talking about the Cold War, we hear about the Berlin Wall tearing families apart all the time. But we never talk about the fact that the US invaded a sovereign country because they were afraid that an election might go differently from how they wanted to go. We are used to thinking that the Soviets were aggressors in the Cuba crisis, placing missiles and such. But we barely even mention that the US had been doing the same thing in Turkey, or that the US literally breached international law by imposing a blockade on Cuba during peacetime, and by attacking Soviet submarines. And we're used to thinking about the Soviet nations in the East as the Soviet bloc, but we barely even talk about the fact that the entirety of Western Europe was practically controlled by the US. Do you think it's a coincidence that no nation occupied by the Americans turned socialist? The Americans made sure to only support the correct parties, the same way the Soviets did. So, now you know the Soviet version of the story. Do I think that we should write this version in the history books? Not really. It's just as biased as the story we already hear, and it's based on some shaky facts just as well. I'd like to hear a story without bias for once, not one where evil Stalin tried to starve Berlin into submission, or one where the evil capitalist nations refused to vacate the capital of a sovereign state. I want a story with both sides, not just the one we like better. Ultimately, it might be impossible to tell a story without bias, but at least now, after having watched this, you might be a bit better at detecting subtle biases. Always ask yourself what the other side of the story may look like, because maybe the Soviet side of the Cuban Missile Crisis might seem a lot more reasonable than the American one. Thanks for watching.
And then, as if they happened after the changes in 1989, it's quite clear that he doesn't know his history, as his cause and effects are in the wrong order. But on top of that, he blames glasnost and perestroika for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, by the looks of his channel, Viki is one of those channels that believes communism was never implemented correctly, which is why he glorifies the Soviet regime. Well, because he wants to follow all its policies, I have to say he messed up. He's using YouTube, a Western commodity. That's not good, Viki. So in my conclusion, this is how your fate would look like back in Soviet times if you were caught with a capitalist product.
You are accused of treason and anti-Soviet behavior. The court finds you guilty and sentences you to be shot.